There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a house where trust has already died, even before anyone knows to grieve it. It isn't the silence of peace. It isn't the silence of rest. It's the silence of a woman who has learned, slowly, over years, to stop asking questions out loud because the answers she receives have never once matched the answers she already knows in her bones. Margaret Elaine Prout was 61 years old when she found the folder. But this story doesn't begin there. It begins the way most quiet devastations begin, not with a dramatic revelation, not with a single terrible night, but with something so small it almost doesn't register. A shift in the air, a changed tone, a door closed 1 second faster than it used to be. It begins on a Tuesday morning in October, in a pale yellow kitchen in a small town outside of Fayetteville, Arkansas, where a woman stood at the sink washing a single coffee mug, her husband's mug, and realized she had not heard him say her name with warmth in over 2 years. Margaret had grown up in this part of Arkansas. She knew the land the way she knew her own hands, every hill, every tree line, every stretch of highway that turned gold in the fall and gray by December. She had married Dennis Prout when she was 24 years old, in a Baptist church her grandmother had attended since before the war, wearing a dress she had sewn partly herself because they didn't have much money then, and she was proud of what she could do with her own 2 hands. That was the version of herself she remembered when things got hard. The young woman who made things work, who stretched a dollar, who showed up. They had built something together, a real life, not a perfect one, but a life with weight and warmth and history. 3 children, a home that had known birthday cakes and summer arguments, and the particular comfort of 2 people who know exactly how the other one takes their coffee without ever having to ask. Dennis had worked in commercial construction management for most of their marriage. He traveled some. He was disciplined with money, or at least, that was what he always told her, and she had believed it because believing him had felt, for a very long time, like the most natural thing in the world. What Margaret did not fully understand, standing at that sink on that October morning, was that belief, the steady, unexamined kind, had been doing the work of keeping her calm for years. She had believed in his loyalty when his phone started facing down on the table. She had believed in his tiredness when he stopped reaching for her hand. She had believed in his stress when he flinched at questions, and believed in his memory when he forgot things she had told him 3 times. She was not a foolish woman. She was a faithful one, and for a long time she had confused those 2 things. The first real crack appeared in the spring of the previous year. Dennis had come home from what he said was a project site visit in Little Rock, carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who has been working hard. She had made dinner. They had eaten mostly in silence, which was no longer unusual. But that night, when he left his jacket over the back of the dining room chair the way he always did, his phone had slipped from the pocket and landed face up on the floor. She hadn't meant to see anything. She wasn't looking. But the screen lit with a notification before she could glance away, and the name she saw there, a woman's name, just a first name, carried with it a small, instinctive jolt of something she couldn't fully name. Not suspicion, exactly, more like recognition. The way you recognize a smell before you can identify where it's coming from. She didn't say anything that night. She washed the dishes. She folded the laundry. She lay in the dark beside him and listened to him breathe and told herself there was an explanation she simply hadn't heard yet. But the feeling didn't leave. It settled in her chest the way cold air settles into an old house, through every crack, persistent, impossible to fully heat away. Over the following weeks, she began to pay attention in the way that women who have been hurt before, or who sense that hurt is coming, learn to pay attention. quietly, without announcement, with the careful, unhurried watchfulness of someone who has learned that asking directly will only produce a performance of innocence rather than the truth itself. She noticed that he had changed the password on his laptop sometime in February, though he had never had one before. She noticed that he stepped outside to take calls that used to happen openly at the kitchen table. She noticed that the credit card statements, which used to come to the kitchen counter, had been set to paperless billing, a change he mentioned casually, framing it as environmentally responsible. She noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, not with love, not with anger, but with the mild, practiced tolerance of a man who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to announce it. Each thing alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a shape she recognized even if she couldn't yet name every edge of it. She mentioned it to him once, just once, in the careful, gentle way she had learned to bring difficult things to Dennis, softly, almost apologetically, as though the very act of noticing something was an imposition on him. She said she had been feeling like something was off between them. She said she just wanted to make sure they were okay. She asked if there was anything he wanted to talk about. He looked at her with a kind of exhausted patience, the look of a man deeply inconvenienced by the emotional needs of the person sitting across from him, and he said that she had always done this, that she created problems where there weren't any, that she was anxious by nature and had been since the day he met her, and that he was tired of being made to feel like a suspect in his own home. She apologized. And she went and made him a cup of coffee, and she stood at the counter with her back to him and pressed her fingernails into the heel of her palm and told herself that maybe he was right. Maybe she was the problem. Maybe the flaw was in the lens, not in what the lens was pointed at. This is what a certain kind of manipulation does to a woman. It does not arrive with cruelty. It arrives with weariness, with sighing, with the steady, repetitive message that her instincts are unreliable, that her feelings are burdens, that the very act of perceiving something is an act of accusation. And Margaret, who had spent 40 years being the steady one, the capable one, the one who managed the household and raised the children and kept the calendar and remembered everyone's allergies and wrote the thank you notes and showed up when it mattered. Margaret had absorbed that message long before she knew she was absorbing it. She was not weak. She had simply been told, in 1,000 subtle ways across 1,000 ordinary days, that her perception of reality was less trustworthy than his. The months that followed were among the loneliest of her life, and that was saying something, because she had known lonely before. She had known the loneliness of a house with young children and a husband who worked long hours. She had known the loneliness of midlife, when the children leave and two people who have organized their lives around others must suddenly look directly at each other and figure out who they still are. But this loneliness was different. This was the loneliness of sharing a bed with someone who has become a stranger and knowing it, and having no one fully believe you, and being made to feel that the fact of your own knowing is a character flaw. She didn't sleep well. She lost weight she didn't need to lose. She stopped calling her sister as often because she didn't know how to explain what was wrong without it sounding like nothing. Just a feeling, just a distance, just a sense that the man she had built her life with had already mentally left the building while continuing to sleep in her house and eat at her table. Her youngest daughter, Cassie, noticed. Cassie was 32, sharp-eyed and direct in the way that daughters who watch their mothers struggle tend to become. She drove up from Little Rock one Saturday in August and sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, and looked at her mother the way a person looks at someone they are genuinely worried about. She asked if things were okay with Dad. Margaret said they were fine. And then she looked out the window and said nothing for a moment too long, and Cassie didn't push, but she didn't look convinced either. The folder was not something Margaret went looking for. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind. In the version of this story, she would eventually tell herself when she needed to understand how she had arrived at the place she arrived. She was not a woman who went snooping. She had not hired anyone. She had not borrowed his phone or gone through his wallet. For all the quiet, careful watching she had done, she had drawn a line at active investigation, partly because she was afraid of what she might find, and partly because something in her still, even then, wanted to be wrong. She had been using his laptop only because hers had stopped charging and she needed to print a form, something to do with her mother's estate paperwork, the kind of administrative task that grief deposits on your doorstep long after the grief itself has passed. Dennis was not home. She knew his old password, the one from before he had changed it, and out of habit she typed it in before remembering it no longer worked. But it did work. He had changed it back, apparently, or perhaps he had grown careless, or perhaps, on some level she would never fully understand. Some part of him had wanted to be found out, wanted someone to finally see the full shape of what he had constructed in the dark. She printed her form. She was about to close the laptop when she noticed a folder on the desktop, labeled with a date from almost 3 years ago, which was several months before she had first noticed anything changing between them. She opened it. There are moments in a life that work like a shutter click. Everything before is one photograph. Everything after is another. The image is the same house, the same furniture, the same light through the same window, but the picture has changed completely because the person looking at it now knows something the person before could not have imagined. What Margaret found in that folder was not what she had expected, even after all these months of quiet suspicion. She had braced herself for messages, maybe, for evidence of someone else. And yes, there was that. There were emails, printed, scanned, and saved as documents, exchanges with a woman whose name she recognized from a phone screen notification 14 months earlier, exchanges that made the nature of their relationship precisely and unmistakably clear. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was the financial documents. There were account statements for accounts she had never known existed. There were transfers, methodical, regular, going back almost 4 years, moving money out of their joint savings and into a private account in his name alone. There were records of a property purchase, a small house, 2 states away, that had been made with their retirement savings, savings she had been told were untouched, savings she had believed were the floor beneath her feet in the event that anything ever went wrong. There were emails between Dennis and someone she eventually understood to be a lawyer, not their shared attorney, a different one, a private one, discussing the timeline and asset positioning in language that was careful and deliberate, and that made clear Dennis had been preparing for a divorce for nearly 3 years while living in her house, eating her food, and telling her she was paranoid for thinking something was wrong. He had not just been unfaithful. He had been systematically dismantling the financial foundation of her life, while gaslighting her into believing her own eyes. She sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The house was very quiet. The October light came through the window the way it always did in the late afternoon, pale and slanted, falling across the table where she and Dennis had eaten 10,000 ordinary meals and had 2,000 ordinary arguments and made, she had believed, a life. She did not cry right away. The feeling was too large for tears. It was the feeling of a floor giving way, not a sudden fall, but a slow, nauseating understanding that what you have been standing on was never solid to begin with. She did not close the laptop. She took photographs of every document with her phone, quietly, methodically, one after the other, until she had a record of everything. Then she closed the laptop and put it back exactly where she had found it. She went to her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands in her lap, and looked at the wall for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called her daughter. She didn't tell Cassie everything, not yet. She just said, "I need you to help me find a lawyer, a good one, and I need you to not tell your father." Cassie, to her credit, asked no questions she didn't need answered in that moment. She simply said, "I'll start looking tonight. I'll call you in the morning." When Dennis came home that evening, Margaret had dinner on the table. She asked about his day. She listened to his answer. She poured him a glass of iced tea and refilled her own glass and looked at the man across from her, the man she had loved for 37 years, and understood, with a finality that felt almost peaceful in its completeness, that she was looking at a stranger who had been wearing a familiar face. She did not confront him, not that night. She had spent enough years being called irrational to know that reacting on emotion, without preparation, without proof documented and safely copied, would only cost her. She had learned something from all those years of being told her instincts couldn't be trusted. She had learned to be strategic with them. She cleared the dishes. She said good night. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about everything she needed to do. The lawyer's name was Patricia Harmon. She was based in Fayetteville, a small woman in her mid-50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of unhurried, precise competence that Margaret had spent her whole life trying to project in rooms where people underestimated her. Patricia listened to everything Margaret told her without interrupting. Then she looked at the photographs on Margaret's phone, one by O. And when she finished, she set the phone down and folded her hands and looked at Margaret directly. She said, "This is serious. What he has done here is serious. And I want you to understand that before we proceed, because serious is not bad news. Serious means there is a great deal we can work with." Margaret had not cried once during the telling. She cried a little now, not from grief, exactly, or not only from grief. She cried from the particular relief of being believed, of sitting across from someone who looked at the same evidence she had been carrying alone for months and confirmed, without hesitation, that yes, her eyes had been telling her the truth all along. What followed was a period of quiet, careful preparation that Margaret would later describe to Cassie as the most focused she had felt in years. She opened her own accounts. She gathered her own financial records. She documented what she could about household contributions, 37 years of labor, of management, of showing up, of making a home function, with Patricia's guidance, building a picture of a marriage in which both people had been essential, even if only one of them had been honest. She did not change her behavior with Dennis. She made his coffee. She asked about his projects. She did not let him see, in anything she said or did, that the terms of their arrangement had already shifted in a way he had not yet been informed of. She was not performing cruelty. She was simply, for the first time in a very long time, performing calm. And it was not performance exactly. She genuinely felt calmer than she had in years because she finally knew what was true, and knowing the truth, even a terrible truth, is an extraordinary relief after months of being told that what you know isn't real. Dennis was served the divorce papers on a Wednesday afternoon in November, when Margaret was not home. She had gone to her sister's house in Bentonville for 2 nights, ostensibly to help with some work on the garden, which was a perfectly ordinary reason to be away. And she had been sitting on her sister Linda's back porch drinking sweet tea when Patricia's paralegal confirmed by text that service had been completed. She put her phone in her lap and looked out at the garden and breathed the cold November air, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even the hot relief of finally being out in the open. She felt tired, deeply, cleanly tired, the way you feel when something very heavy has been set down and you realize your body has been carrying it for so long that even its absence takes some getting used to. Linda sat beside her and didn't ask questions. She just poured more tea. That was the thing about Linda. She had always known when words were useless and presence was enough. It was a quality Margaret had not always appreciated in her sister. She appreciated it enormously now. Dennis called that evening. She did not answer. He called again. She let it go to voicemail. He did not leave a message. He called again the next morning. She answered that one, calmly, and told him that anything he needed to say to her could go through Patricia's office. Her voice was steady. She was not unkind. She had never been the kind of woman who wanted to wound, even when she had been wounded, and she saw no reason to start now. He said her name. He said it the way he hadn't said it in years, with something in it that might have been genuine, or might have been fear, or might have been both, and she couldn't fully tell the difference anymore. She said she hoped he was well, and then she ended the call. What followed was not clean or quick. The process took 11 months, and there were difficult days inside those months, days when the weight of it pressed down on her like something physical, when she missed the home they had shared not because she wanted him back, but because grief and loss are not logical, and sometimes you can mourn a life even while understanding clearly why that life had to end. There were also the children to navigate. Their son, Robert, took the news hard. He was close to his father in the way that first sons sometimes are, and his first instinct was to seek a balance that didn't exist, to find some way in which both parents shared equally in the failure of the marriage. Because accepting that his father had deliberately deceived his mother required a restructuring of his entire understanding of the man he had looked up to. Margaret did not push him. She gave him the time he needed. She also, at the appropriate moment, showed him the documents. Not all of them, not the ones she felt were too private, the communications that belonged to her grief and not to her children's processing of it, but enough. Enough for Robert to understand that what had happened to his mother was not a mutual unraveling. It was a calculated withdrawal, conducted in secret, while she continued to faithfully in the dark. He drove up from Jonesboro on a Sunday afternoon a few months into the process, and he sat across from his mother at the same kitchen table, and he cried in a way she hadn't seen him cry since he was a teenager. He apologized. He said he hadn't wanted to believe it. She told him she understood that. She told him he didn't owe her an apology for his struggle. She poured him coffee and sat with him in the quiet, and when he left that afternoon, he hugged her for a long time in the driveway in the cold air, and she felt, in that hug, something shifting between them, a new kind of closeness that had been earned by honesty and could not have come any other way. The financial settlement was not everything she might have hoped for, but it was significantly more than Dennis had intended her to receive when he began his private preparations. The hidden account was discovered and factored into the settlement. The property purchased with their retirement savings was addressed. Patricia Harmon had been exactly what Margaret needed her to be, methodical, prepared, and entirely unsentimental about what the law entitled her to. And the outcome, while not painless, was fair. Fair mattered to Margaret enormously. Not just the financial fairness, though that was essential. She was 61 years old, and the idea of beginning again without the foundation she had helped build would have been genuinely frightening. But the fairness of being seen. of having a process that acknowledged, in its formal, legal way, that her 37 years had meant something, that her labor had value, that what had been taken from her without consent was real and had a name. She moved out of the family home in June and into a smaller house on the other side of town, a house with a big front porch and 2 old oak trees in the yard, and a kitchen with a window that faced east, which meant she got the morning light on her coffee, which felt like a small and private kind of wealth. She had picked it herself, every detail. She had painted the living room a deep, soft green that people who visited would later say felt like a room that breathed. She put her mother's quilt on the back of the reading chair. She hung pictures she had always loved that had never fit the aesthetic of the house she had shared with Dennis. She arranged her own kitchen the way it made sense to her, not to anyone else, and she stood in the middle of it on the first morning and made herself a full breakfast and ate it at the table in front of the east-facing window and watched the light move and didn't feel, for the first time in a very long time, like she was waiting for anything. It would be false and too simple to say she healed quickly or completely, or that the ending of the marriage resolved cleanly into peace without remainder. The truth of rebuilding after a long betrayal is more textured than that. There were mornings she woke with the specific, disorienting weight of grief that doesn't care how justified your choices are. There were moments in ordinary life, hearing an old song, passing a restaurant they had liked, finding a photo at the back of a drawer, when the loss of what had been real, even inside what had been a lie, settled on her with a heaviness that surprised her every time. She started going to a weekly group for women navigating major life transitions, not a therapy group exactly, more of a conversation circle hosted by a woman at a community center in town. She went the first time because Cassie asked her to try it. She kept going because of what she found there. Women her age and older, with different stories but the same essential shape of experience, who had also spent years being the steady ones, the capable ones, the ones who managed and maintained and believed and showed up, and who had arrived, by different roads, at the same reckoning with what they had given and what they had gotten back. She was not the only one who had been told her instincts were wrong. She was not the only one who had apologized for perceiving correctly. She was not the only one who had stood at a sink or a stove or a window and known something that she couldn't yet prove and had been made to feel that the knowing itself was the problem. There was profound comfort in this. Not the comfort of shared grievance. She was not, and had never been, a woman who found relief in bitterness, but the comfort of recognition, of being in a room full of women who understood, without explanation, the particular damage that is done to a person when they are systematically separated from trust in their own perception. She began slowly to reclaim her own knowing, to practice trusting what she noticed, to say out loud to herself and then to others, "I see that, I notice that, that is real." These seem like small things. They were not small things. There is an evening she comes back to often. It was late winter, about 8 months after she had moved into the new house, and she had built a fire in the fireplace, something she had always loved but which Dennis had found excessive and unnecessary, so they almost never had one, and she was sitting in her reading chair with a book in her lap and her mother's quilt over her legs and a glass of wine on the side table. Her granddaughter, Cassie's oldest, had called that afternoon just to talk, nothing particular. She was 19 in her first year of college, and she called sometimes on her walk between classes just to hear her grandmother's voice. They had talked about her classes, about a boy she was cautiously interested in, about a professor she found intimidating. Margaret had listened and asked questions and laughed at the right moments, and when they hung up, she had felt something she couldn't quite name in the moment. Sitting by the fire that evening, she named it. She felt useful, not in the exhausted, invisible way of someone who is useful because they are always available and never allowed to be otherwise, but in the warm, reciprocal way of someone who has something real to offer and is genuinely wanted for it. She felt like herself, the self that had always been there, underneath the years of shrinking, underneath the voice that had learned to preface every observation with "I could be wrong," but the self that could sit by a fire she had built herself, in a house she had chosen herself, in a quiet she had earned, and feel, not bitterness toward the past, but something closer to gratitude that she had found her way to this. She had lost 37 years with a man who saw her primarily as a background character in his own story. She had also not lost what she had built in those years: her children, her relationships, her understanding of what real love looks like and what it doesn't, her knowledge of her own capacity to survive and adapt and still, in the middle of hard things, show up with dignity. She had not lost herself, even in all the years she had been closest to it. She had simply not known, for a while, where she had put herself down. The last thing she told Cassie, in a conversation they had the following spring, sitting on the porch of the new house with coffee, watching the yard wake up in the early warm. She said, "I think the hardest part wasn't finding out the truth. I knew the truth before I found it. The hardest part was believing, for so long, that I wasn't allowed to know what I knew." Cassie was quiet for a moment, then she said, "But you found it anyway." Margaret looked out at the yard. The oaks were coming back into leaf, that tentative, early green that always looked, to her, like possibility caught in the act of becoming something certain. "Yes," she said, "I found it anyway." She picked up her coffee and held it in both hands the way she had always liked to, feeling the warmth of it, the weight of it, the simple, sensory satisfaction of a good thing held closely on a cool morning. And she sat in the light and breathed and was, quietly and completely, exactly where she was. Not waiting, not managing, not performing calm for someone who had decided her feelings were too much. Just here, just this, just the morning and the coffee and the oaks. Just herself, finally, fully, and for the first time in a very long time herself.